up, my channel? It's your friendly neighborhood sassy blonde writer coming at you with another writing video. As you can see, a little bit blonder, a little bit sassier as well. It is April, which means it is National Poetry Writing Month, so I thought it would be really cool to kind of do some poetry videos. I know this isn't very popular on authortube. Authortube generally is more focused on novel writing. However, I believe a story is a story. You can be an author of a short story, a book of essays, a book of poetry as well. And there are also different ways to tell a story, such as a novel in verse, which is where you tell a story through poetry. I know this topic isn't very popular among authortubers, but I've noticed that some of my videos that cover topics around poetry, specifically poetry publication, and I'll link to them either in the cards or in the description, or maybe both, have been pretty popular. So I get the feeling that some people want this to be discussed, and I am more than willing to discuss it. So here we go. Before we dive on into the basics of poetry, so if you're in the mood to brush up on the basics of poetry, or you want to get to know some more examples of different types of poetry, this video is for you. Before we dive on in, however, I just want to remind you all to please subscribe to my channel. Every subscription counts, and if you would subscribe to my channel, it would just make my day. I post new videos on Wednesdays, and if you enjoy these types of videos, please hit that like button so that way I know you want more fabulous content like this. So let's dive on into the basics of poetry. Oh, and before we do a really deep dive, I just want to give a shout out to my friend over on Instagram. She's a bookstagrammer. Her name is Literary Lea. She helped me out a lot with this. I'm more fluent in the Emily Dickinson, Langston Hughes, Maya Angelou types of poetry, but my friend Literary Lea really helped me out with the more modern poetry, so she helps me make this video. Thank you so much, Leah, for all your help. So even if you're not planning on becoming a poet anytime soon, I highly recommend just trying to write poetry every now and then, just to give it a shot, just to sharpen your writing skills. You're probably wondering, why is it that we always learn about poetry when we're really young? Because one of the ironic things is, you probably think we learn about poetry when we're in like second grade, when you're probably too young to really understand it. The thing is that developmentally, that's actually the best time to start learning about poetry. Now, obviously, depending on which types of poets you're studying, some of it may go over your head, but poetry is actually very helpful in language development, creativity, writing skills, self-expression, and development of natural rhythms. Another thing about poets is they are basically the opposite of prose writers. Prose writers tend to use pretty much every word possible when they are writing. Poets, on the other hand, try to use as few words as possible when they are writing to get their point across. This is called the economy of words. The economy of words is making every single word as impactful as possible. And when you're a poet, this is something that you really master. So when it comes to poetry, there's a lot of different techniques and different elements that you have to keep in mind when you're writing poetry. The more you read poetry, the more you notice them. And even when you're listening to songs, reading poetry, writing poetry, the more you think about it, the more you're aware of these, the more you notice that they happen. And it also happens in prose as well, so it's just important to be aware of it. Poetic devices do come up in prose, so they are worthwhile to talk about. So one technique that is used a lot is alliterations. Alliteration is the occurrence of the same letter or sound at the beginning of the adjacent or closely connected words. So it's Peter Piper picked a pail of pickled peppers, or come clean the chaos in your closet. That is alliteration that's used a lot in poetry. Another one is assonance. This one, in poetry, it's the repetition of the sound of a vowel or a diphthong in a non-rhyming stressed syllable, near enough for the echo to be discernible. So for Dr. Seuss's Green Eggs and Ham, I do not like green eggs and ham, I do not like them, Sam, I am. So the stressed syllables are eggs and ham, Sam, I am. That is assonance. In Edgar Allan Poe's Annabel Lee, and so all the night tide, I lay down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride. Another one is consonants. In poetry, consonance is the recurrence of similar sounds, especially consonants, like that's anything that's not a vowel. In close proximity, chiefly used prosody. Unlike alliteration, the repeated consonant sounds do not need to be at the beginning of a word. So an example of consonants is Mike likes his new bike. So it's the opposite of alliteration, where instead of the beginning of the word sounding similar, the end of the word sounds similar. In Shakespeare's Hamlet, an example of that would be a little more than kin, a little less than kind. So the words have similar sounds, and they're in close proximity to each other, and that just gives them a nice little word feel. Rhyme is the correspondence of sound between words and the ending of words, especially when these are used at the ends of lines in poetry. You have different rhyme schemes like The Hill We Climb. Oh, I guess I should read The Hill We Climb by Amanda Gorman. Okay, this isn't going to be as good as her reading. When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find the light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, the sea we must wade. We brave the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just is isn't always justice. Scheme is A, B, C, B, D, D, and D is a slant rhyme, E, F, F. We also have internal rhyme, which is a rhyme involving a word in the middle of the line and another at the end of the line or in the middle of the text. So it's tricky. Run DMC is an example of internal rhyme. Another example is The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe, which is once upon a time a midnight dreary, while I ponder weekend weary. That's like within the line is a rhyme. Then of course there's imagery, and imagery is visually descriptive or figurative language, especially in literary work, often evoking sensory perceptions. And imagery encompasses a whole bunch of stuff. You got symbolism, you got metaphors, similes, allegories, etc., etc. I could literally talk all day about poetic devices, but then this video would be really long and people would probably stop watching it really soon. So another element of poetry is form, another thing to keep in mind, which is basically another word for style. Most people use lyric, narrative, or descriptive styles of poetry. Lyric poem is basically any poem where one speaker, not necessarily the poet, who expresses strong thoughts or feelings. A narrative poem is a poem that tells a story. A really good example of that is Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. That's an example of a novel in verse where it is literally telling you a story. The character who's telling the story is basically writing in her diary. She writes her about her experiences in poems to kind of process things. So it's a really good book. I highly recommend it. It's a great example of a novel in verse. Another example is Love That Dog for younger, quicker example. That's another novel in verse where it's like a small child kind of processing the poetry unit that his teacher is going over in class. A descriptive poem is a poem that describes the world that surrounds the speaker. So those are those poems that describe a duck. The duck goes quack quack through the forest. Or just describes nature. More outward focus than lyrical poetry. A lot of times when people think about poetry, they think of the lyrical poetry, which is more inward and introspective. But when you're first getting into poetry, I recommend starting with just the descriptive poetry, just describing things around you using poetic devices, because that's just a bit easier when you're just starting out than just doing a deep dive into other things, just so you can get a handle on the different ways you use poetry, different poetic devices, the different techniques, because every form of writing has its own idiosyncrasies. So when you're just starting out with poetry, I recommend going with more outward focused stuff, so that way you can really hone your craft and then go into the more introspective stuff. As we discussed, we have sound patterns, figurative devices, etc. You're probably wondering, what are all the different types of poetry? So what are some great examples of poetry if you're looking to either branch out into the genre, you know some stuff from like your days in school and you want to branch out, or this is your first time really experiencing it as a genre? So, I mean, of course you have the classics. You have Emily Dickinson, you have Shakespeare, William Butler Yeats, you have Langston Hughes, Maya Angelou, Pablo Neruda. Some of Literary Lea's favorites are Allen Ginsberg's poems, just all of them. She also recommends My Mother Was a Freedom Fighter by Aja Monet, both of Clementine Yvonne Roddick's full books, all of Stacey Ann Chin's poems, the full books. If I come up with any other books that you should check out, I will leave them in the comments below. And if you have any poetry books that you think I should check out, please let me know in the comments below. That's all I have for you today, folks. I hope you enjoyed this video on the introduction into poetry. I'm sorry if it was a little all over the place, but I hope you enjoyed it. If you want more deep dives into different types of genres and little introductions into different ways you can be an author besides just writing novels, please let me know. Hit that like button if you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to subscribe, and of course, happy writing and happy National Poetry Writing Month.